Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very excited to introduce our returning guest. He's a professor of philosophy, a legend in the objectivist world, author of many books. His new book, Why Johnny Still Can't Read or Write or Understand Math and What We Can Do About It. It's Andrew Bernstein. Andy, welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, William. It's great to be back on. Always fun talking to you guys.
Good. Well,
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to talk to you again. I really enjoyed our last conversation. I look forward to many more.
Yeah, thanks. Me too, William.
Good. Well, I want to jump right into it. For those that may not realize, the title's a reference to a book from the 50s, Why Johnny Can't Read by Rudolf Flesch, and Peikoff did a book, Why Johnny Can't Think. And you know, I remember seeing video of you before the pandemic. You were like walking from class to class with some GoPro helmet, talking as the education guy. And I still have a lot of respect for that energy, but I'm wondering how much of the book came about because of what you were seeing on the ground.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Scott. The education guy, you know, I did those live videos, you know, under that name. Yeah, I've been teaching in the colleges for 40 years. I mean, I went to the government schools. I don't think we should use the term public schools. It's a euphemism. You know, all private schools are open to the public. The government schools, I went K through 12 to government schools in Brooklyn. Looking back on now, they weren't very good then, but they've gotten progressively worse. I've seen it, you know, over 40 years of teaching. You know, I used to use the Fountainhead as the main text in all my ethics courses, and I can't anymore because so many of the kids, and these are good American kids. I mean, I like them personally, but you know, they struggle just with the mechanics of reading in many cases, and so reading a book like the Fountainhead is really torture. It's torture for them. They just don't get it. So most of them can't write, you know, they struggle to read. They can't write a coherent paragraph. Don't know in many cases, never mind a college level essay. Don't know the first thing about American history. And so, yeah, I've seen the decline. And so I realized I'm in a position to be able to fight this. And when I really realized it, guys, it was when I was working on my hero book, you know, Heroes, Legends, Champions, Why Heroism Matters. And I, you know, induced the principles of heroism from various examples. And one of them was Maria Montessori. And when I saw the progressives, you know, William Hurd Kilpatrick, who was John Dewey's main disciple, you know, go after Maria Montessori immediately. It's like 1912, 1914, something like that. It hit me at a new level. You know, Ayn Rand talks about spiraling back to knowledge you already had, but with a deeper level of understanding. It hit me at a deeper level. These guys did it on purpose. They messed up the school system. They did it on purpose. It wasn't an accident. And then when you think about it, it would have to be. You can't mess up something this bad by accident. It had to be on purpose. And I realized I'm in a position to fight this. I wrote a long essay on this for the Objective Standard. I started, you know, as the videos as the education guy. And then, you know, I realized, let me write a book, because, you know, with a book I could get on radio and I could do, you know, interviews and, you know, stuff. And so I wrote the book. And yeah, you're right, Scott. It came right out of what I see in the classroom almost every day.
I was wondering, Andrew, if you have if you can provide just some basic facts, like numbers or statistics, to give us a sense of how bad it actually is in the educational world. Like I've heard numbers like 50% of students can't read at a 6th grade level, or of adults, like 50% of adults can't read at a 6th grade level. Is that true? And like, can you give us some other examples?
Yeah, there is research showing you know, things like that, William. Yeah, right before the pandemic, the 2019 NAEP test, they call it the you know, the nation's report card. The National Assessment of Educational Progress. It should be the National Assessment of Educational Regress. You know, sadly, it should be the NAER. But you know, they test thousands of 4th graders and 8th graders around the country every 2 years. And this is before the pandemic, you know, before kids got locked out of the classroom. And sometimes I think getting locked out of the classroom may be the best thing for the kids. They may avoid some of the leftist indoctrination that way, but because they're not getting an education anyway, when they're in the classroom or not. But anyhow,
They're getting an anti-education.
yeah, exactly. They're getting indoctrinated. But even before the pandemic, the fourth graders and the eighth graders starting, in 2019, starting from a very low baseline, they either regressed or remained stagnant. Get this, the only progress was, I think it was the fourth graders. I have it in the book, but the fourth graders, I think, progressed in math 1 point from 240 out of a possible 500 to 241. Now, I was never the world's greatest math student, going to the government schools didn't help that. But 240 out of 500, even I could figure out, that's 48%. That's an abysmally failing grade. And this is nationwide. This is indicative. So they, improved by 1 point. But yeah, the numbers are very ugly. I don't remember a lot of the numbers offhand, but yeah, the PISA tests, that test internationally, again, the American kids score so much lower on academic tests than a lot of kids from a lot of European and Asian countries. And the reason for that is in Europe and Asia, and a lot of the countries anyway, they teach academic subjects more broadly and more deeply than they do in the United States. So it's not an accident that you see these miserable test scores, 240 out of 500, as a national average in math. I mean, it's appalling, and it's heartbreaking. These are good kids, guys, and they're good American kids. They want to have a successful career. They want a romantic relationship, but their minds have been stunted. They've been robbed of the education they deserve, and the test scores show that year after year after year. So it's going back for decades. So it's not getting any better.
I mean, I agree. It was a problem long before the pandemic, even when you were going to school to some extent, or when I was going to school in the 80s. I mean, I got educated in those schools and I did a lot of self-learning, but it still wasn't near as bad as it is now. Something changed since then to accelerate it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one indication here of how you're right, and then we can look at what accelerated the decline. When I was in high school, I was such a troublemaker, guys. I got kicked out of every advanced placement, honors background classes the school had. So here I am in 1969 in a garden variety English class at a government high school in Brooklyn, New York, and I remember reading Crime and Punishment, in that class. I remember reading Macbeth. I don't remember what else we read, but I remember that, those are two classics, Shakespeare and Dostoevsky, right? And I remember I had a good teacher. We wrote papers on these books, and the teacher worked on our papers with us. So yeah, it wasn't great back then, but there was at least some learning there. So 50 years later, I won't mention any names here, but my daughter's high school, she's in college now. She was at an upscale, Tony, suburban high school, public high school, government high school, supposed to be really good. In their 12th grade English class, they didn't read a thing. They didn't read a single work of literature. They spent the whole year working on their college essays. So at least, that helps the kids with their writing, I guess. But if the kids were reading classics, Lisa Van Dam is right. You start out with children's books, classics like Peter Pan or The Secret Garden or Anne of Green Gables, and you have the kids write paragraphs on this in first grade, second grade, and by the time you get, I don't know, fourth or fifth grade, you're reading plays, and by the time you get to middle school, you're reading classics of world literature, and you're writing papers by that, on every, whether you read Cyrano or Hamlet or whether you're reading A Tale of Two Cities, or you're reading Jane Eyre, or you're reading Pride and Prejudice, whatever it is, and you write papers on these, and the teacher's working with you on your writing as they should be. By the time you get to 12th grade, how much work would the kids need on their college essays in the first place? And a whole year, 12th grade, they're deprived of any access to the world's great literature. So yeah, it's gotten. Can you imagine reading nothing? A 12th grade suburban high school, they're reading nothing in their English classes. My God. Yeah, they should be reading Dostoevsky and Shakespeare for sure, and Ayn Rand. They should be reading The Fountainhead and and/or Atlas Shrugged. Anyhow, so I mean, what's gotten worse, the woke mentality of racists has become very prevalent. I mean, the left controls the school system. We know that the woke mentality has become prevalent in the school system. Where does that come from? It comes from postmodernism. You know, the postmodernists are Marxists. You know, Marx sees the world, the social world, as a struggle between economic classes, right? The rich oppress the poor. Marx sees the world in terms of groups, not individuals, in terms of economic classes. The rich oppress the poor. Well, the postmodernists, people like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, and people like that, agree with Marx, but they say Marx defined the oppressor and the oppressed too narrowly. It's not just yes, Western society is characterized completely by oppression, but it's not just the rich oppressing the poor. It's the whites oppressing the non-whites. It's the males oppressing the females. It's the straights oppressing the gays, and so on and so forth. We just have Western society, especially America, is just this seething cauldron of oppression. And it's our moral obligation to side with the oppressed in that struggle. And that mentality has taken over the humanities divisions of our universities. Oh my God, it's unbelievable how bad.
I was going to say, if you have too many classics, they'll tell you to decolonize your bookshelf.
Decolonize. That's exactly, you got the terminology. That's,
Scott, to your question about, why has it gotten worse? It occurs to me that if you inject this progressive program into education, and then what happens is the good teachers recognize that it's garbage, and they start leaving the public schooling system and going into these private schools, which, Andrew, you talk about in your book as well. You talk about like the Montessori schools and the one in Chicago, West Side Prep.
Marva Collins, right?
Yeah, and then these private schools, they need teachers, right? So the good teachers, they want to actually teach kids, so they go to these private schools, and then that you get like a brain drain from the public school system, and so it just declines, and you start seeing the good teachers, they
you're right.
School system.
You're right. That's absolutely true. And here's some good news about the brain drain, William, is that in the last few years, so many teachers in the government school system, and there are still a lot of good classroom teachers, and some school districts are better than others, but a lot of the better school teachers are as disgruntled with the stifling bureaucracy and the leftist propaganda, as are many of the parents, and they're opting out of the school system, and they contract with a few families to start what today are being called micro schools. These tiny little private schools that some parent has, a rec room in their basement, and they set up a small little classroom with 3 or 4 families, and the teacher, usually a woman, sometimes a man. It's like the return to the old school norm, And these are generally the teachers who realize the kids need phonics to learn how to read. They need academic subjects. They need real American history, not Howard Zinn's book. It was A People's History of the United States, which is this pure communist propaganda. These are some of the better teachers, and this phenomenon of micro schools, which are really just small community schools, it's become so prevalent that Forbes, was a business magazine, read an article on it a year or two ago, on the micro schools. And there are people who are calling this the return of the one-room schoolhouse. And I think this is a very positive sign for the future of American education. But it comes out of the real negatives that you're talking about, William, the horrors of the government school system and the better teachers opting out.
Yeah, because this conflict isn't new that we're seeing today. You talk about the battle between the progressives going all the way back to like 1918 versus Maria Montessori and other and the great books creators.
Right.
They had this battle about what is the correct way to teach a kid, or like what's the correct program, and then you also talk about phonics versus the whole word method. So there were all these debates going back 100 years, And so this is just what we're seeing today is just a result of what I think is the private schooling people winning, like basically winning the argument, but not, they can't get into the government because the government's shutting them down.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. This battle goes back to World War I, so it's more than 100 years now, and the so-called progressives, and guys, the great Chinese philosopher Confucius once said that the beginning of wisdom is to see to it that things are called by their right names, which is true. And these guys are not progressive. There's nothing progressive about socialism, much less communism. So I don't call them progressives, but that's what they're known as. John Dewey, in the philosophy department at Columbia University for many years. His leading disciple, William Hurd Kilpatrick, who ran the philosophy of education department at Columbia's Teachers College, when Teachers College was training, thousands and thousands and thousands of the top teachers all over the country. These guys militate, and their supporters, they militated against phonics. They don't want the kids, they don't want to use phonics to teach reading. And phonics is the system that works because there's only 26 letters in the alphabet, 40 something sounds. It's very easy. And here's the good news for parents. It's very easy for parents to teach their kids how to read. There's two steps. First one is show the child at a very early age that books are fun. So I used to take my daughter to the library or the bookstore when she was like 2. And she'd pick out a book and she'd sit down on the floor. Usually there's always some goofy thing about, dogs that could fly or whatever. But to her, it was fun. And she'd sit down on the floor. She asked me to read to her, and I would read it to her. And so she would learn. And books are cool. There's fun stuff in books. And once at that point, the child's motivated, wants to learn how to read, doesn't want to depend on mom or dad or the teacher. And by the time the kid's a motivated child's 4 or 5 years old, using phonics, systematic phonics, teach them the sounds of the letters and the sounds of the combination of letters. And in a matter of weeks, by the time they're 4 or 5 years old, the kid's speaking thousands of words in their mother tongue. In 4 or 5 weeks, you could teach in several weeks, you could teach a motivated child how to match, the verbal symbols for a word that he or she already knows with the literary symbols on the page. It's not this tortuous process that schools have made it. And the reason the schools have made it this way is I don't want the kids to. This will segue us into the political discussions later, but they want the kids basically to obey the state, But yeah, you're right, William. 100 years of this, the militating against phonics, less and less and less academic subjects for most of us, whether it's practical skills like hygiene, sex ed, driver's ed, or vocational training like wood shop or metal shop or agricultural in the rural areas. Less and less academics, less math, less literature, less history, less science, and so on and so on for most of us. They've dumbed down the curriculum tremendously, and they've done it deliberately. And now we have a society of semi-illiterates, and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, so my other question was about their motivation for doing this. So you don't like the word progressive, so we'll just call them Marxist. It's a Marxist education.
Right.
And one of the motivations you offer,
William, it's still a free country. You could use any word you want. I just don't use progressive.
Yeah. So the Marxists, you saying that they did this because it was considered a eugenics program, like the smart kid, they used IQ tests to figure out who was a smart kid and he would get academic training, and then the lesser intellects would be sent to vocational schools and go into the factories. But do you think part of the motivation might have also been because we were at war? This was 1918. The world had just, was in a world war, and, there was going to be just a whole nother century of wars. And if you're in a state of war, don't you need to train your kids to be soldiers?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting take on it, William, but 1918, the war ended in 1918.
We had gone through the First World War. But
yeah.
So there was this global conflict brewing, or had already started and then was continuing. So do you think that this is the mindset, a part of the mindset? I think eugenics is a lot of it, but do you think part of it is also that And, like, because you also mentioned Sparta versus Athens. And I noted that Sparta beat Athens in the Peloponnesian War. So I guess there's some historical merit, you'd say, to training the body over the mind, because the body's a big part of being a human being. And if you don't have strong, skilled warriors, you can't defeat your enemy in war.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, but I think they Dewey and those, and Kilpatrick and their ilk, I think they stated their reasons. Well, one thing we could say for them is they're not merely Mao. They said it so in so many words. They want individual, and Dewey's very forthright in this. He wants the individual to serve the state. So being soldiers is one way. You got to obey. Training kids to be soldiers like they did in Sparta, from age 7, is one way to train a society of uneducated, semi-illiterate, obedient followers. But they didn't make a big deal about soldiering. They wanted factory workers. They wanted farm workers. They wanted, the idea was, you mentioned that IQ test, and I discussed that in the book, and why Johnny still can't read or write or understand math, and what we could do about it. Back then IQ tests had first come in, and so their idea was, we'll IQ test the kids. We'll find the best and the brightest. They get the full academic program. The best and the brightest. They get literature and science and mathematics and history. And the rest of us, the overwhelming bulk of the population, there'll be a second track for us. We'll get a modicum of academics, but we don't need that much. And we get a lot of practical training and, vocational skills, and stuff. Because the goal is that, those who get the few who get this is Plato, the philosopher king mentality. The few, the elite here, the few elite intelligent people, they'll go on to college, and they'll be society's future leaders, both in the classroom, and in the legislature. Whereas the rest of us, we don't need to think very much. In fact, they don't want us to think very much. We need to be good at our jobs and obey the wise rulers of the state. That's the goal, whether that's soldiers, factory workers, farmers, whatever. But to be good at our jobs and obey the wise rulers of the state. That was the goal. Now today, it's been exacerbated, because today we were talking about the postmodernists and the woke ideology. It's not just practical skills in the schools anymore. Now it's flat out leftist propaganda, about, man-made warming is destroying the planet, capitalism's evil, socialism is morally superior. There's dozens of different, I can't even say this with a straight face, there's dozens of genders. We could be any gender we want, and you got to tell the kids at 5 or 6 or 7 years old they need to choose what gender they are. It's this kind of leftist insanity is being pushed in the schools. But one last point, guys, where did Dewey and Kilpatrick and their supporters, where did they pilgrimage to find the educational system that they thought was best? They went to the Soviet Union. They, under Stalin in the late 1920s, they came back from the Soviet freaking Union with glowing reports on Soviet education. Well, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? That's what they want. And it is really clear today. It's really clear that they want not just socialism. I think, the push ultimately is towards communism, real totalitarian state.
Yeah, I mean, I wondered how much of this kind of modern education came from an attempt to close the achievement gaps and to say, oh, well, it's because, you have all these unconscious privileges you're not even aware of, and that's the only reason there's disparity in education.
Right. Yeah, well, that's the contemporary, the contemporary mentality. They're shutting down, classes for the brightest kids in many cases, for advanced placement or honors classes, because they don't want they claim to be against that disparity, in the education, what they call the education gap, or the achievement gap. So it's obviously the right idea would be to develop programs to bring up the kids who are struggling. But no, they're Marxists. You're right. They're communists. Their idea is let's bring down, the kids who are not struggling, the kids who are doing well. Did you see, William, I think you asked about numbers before. Did you see some of those numbers from Project Baltimore in Baltimore, Maryland?
No, were they in your book? I think there's something
I think I just
read
mentioned
about.
it briefly, but I've seen numbers.
Yeah, but I read something in your book about it, but I haven't studied it.
Yeah, I haven't either, but I've seen numbers subsequent to writing the book that I mean, it's just jaw dropping. There's, in some of the government high schools in Baltimore, Maryland, yeah, the high school kids is like many of them, some significant percentage are reading at a first grade level or a second grade level or a third grade level. These are, 15, 16, 17-year-old high school kids. And there's many, is like a large number of them. I forget the percentage, but it was high. It's heartbreaking. It's terrifying for the future of the country.
Yeah, it is. It's terrible. And this might be a small question here. I was wondering, like, they say they read at a first grade level, and I was wondering what kind of measurement is that if someone who can't read at a first grade level or a second grade level gets passed on to the second grade level. So you have these 16, 17-year-olds who can only read at the first grade level. How did they get to the 12th grade?
Yeah, again, this goes back. I mean, this was what they call social promotion was in effect when I was a kid. I went back, further than that. I'm not sure how far, but this is one instance of the war against the mind, the war against intellectual development. I mentioned in the book in early 1950s, a professor, American, he's a professor of history. His name is Arthur Bestor. Bestor. He wrote a book, Educational Wastelands, 1952, 1953, something like that. He's a professor of history. I don't remember what American university, but Bestor talked about what he called the interlocking directorate. Who has the power in the government schools? And he pointed out one is the teachers' colleges or the schools of education, two, the state departments of education, three, the federal Department of Education and its forerunners, back then. The interlocking directorate does not want this, this is exactly what we've been discussing, does not want most of the kids to read well, does not want most of the kids to get much academic training. They war against factual knowledge. They don't want the kids, for instance, to learn geography, the mountain ranges, the rivers, the different continents, the oceans. I want them to learn basic facts of the solar system. The Earth revolves around the sun, and so on and so forth. They're against factual knowledge. They're against academic training. It's a war on the mind that's gone back for 100 years. And social promotion that we're talking about is one instance of it. Doesn't matter how poorly, this goes back at least to the 1950s and maybe further back than that. It doesn't matter how poorly Johnny or Judy does in first grade. He or she then gets promoted to second grade based on age. It's and you just keep pushing them. You keep pushing them through the school system, regardless of what their academic achievements are. You don't want to stigmatize the kid. You don't want to harm their self-esteem. And then I guess they never raised if they really were concerned about the child's self-esteem, which they're not. But if they were, they might raise the question: what it's going to do to this poor kid's self-esteem when he's 15 years old? He's reading at a second grade level. But they never raise that kind of question. They're opposed to academics because they want people to obey the state. If people are trained to think well, you have basic cognitive skills, you're a strong reader, which is not hard to become. You write well, you have basic mathematical skills and mathematical calculation. These are all thinking skills. History. You're much more likely to challenge the moral rectitude of the regime than you are if you don't know, if you're not a good thinker and you don't have any factual knowledge. It's the postmodernists like to say everything is politics. I mean, that's false. Politics is politics, and literature is literature, for example. But in their world, everything is politics. And it's all about their political vision of setting up.
And when they make everything politics, we
Right.
have to focus on it more too.
Yeah, exactly right. And
Well, I
for
like
those,
this. I like this narrative of the interlocking directorate. It reminds me of the Borg ship in Star Trek.
yeah, right. That's right.
And I think the narrative is something that a lot of people have been focusing on now. You know, like you got to change the narrative or control the narrative. And I think there's some truth to that. I think you need a good story. You talk about storytelling in your book and the importance of that in teaching. And I think it goes to it also is important in teaching people about the current state of our educational system in general. And like if you refer to the interlocking directorate or the educational bureaucracy as the board ship or some menacing thing, then that gives this nice narrative or story to it, and it will help the common person relate to what your facts are and what the evidence is.
Yeah. No, you're right. I did, in my chapter on teacher training, I focused on telling stories, lots of examples, induce principles. You start with the examples and pull up your explanatory principles right out of the examples so the kids can actually see it, right at the sea level, as I call it, right at the level of observational reality. And teacher training, that's something we should discuss, because the teacher training is abysmal. I just saw a quote from, what's his name in California, Eric Swalwell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw a quote from him echoing what Terry McAuliffe said a couple of years ago. That teachers, although it was last year actually, parents shouldn't have any, something to the effect that parents shouldn't have any say in the teaching of their children. And Swalwell said, well, we're going to let the patients do the surgery, when they need an operation, are we going to let the passengers fly the plane or something like that? Since when did we stop trusting experts? Oh man. Well, aside from the fact that the analogy is false, and patients should have a lot of say, and in a free country have a lot of say on whether they have surgery or not. But even aside from that, in many cases, teachers are no longer experts and have not been for a long time. And the reason for that is they're not taking courses they're taking fewer courses in the subjects they're going to teach, because they're required, I think in every state in the country, to take a whole bunch of education courses. Most high school teachers and elementary school teachers major in education. And so the future math teachers are taking significantly fewer math courses than a garden variety math major will. And the future English teachers are taking fewer literature courses than the garden variety literature major does, because they're required to take so many education courses. So this was really driven home to me. And speaking of stories, guys, I told this story in the book. In 1999, 2000, when Cliff Notes hired me to write the Cliff Notes for Ayn Rand's novels. And I think your audience knows what Cliff Notes is, right? There's study guides for great works of literature. And they told me this, the general editor told me, he was a really good guy. He said, when we started out, I think Cliff Notes goes back to the 1950s, 1960s, our main demographic was high school and college students. And I remember my high school English teachers, and then I was an English major in college, the English professors, don't read the Cliff Notes. Right? Not because the Cliff Notes aren't any good, they are, but because they didn't want, understandably did not want us to read the Cliff Notes instead of the novels. Well, by the year 2000, a lot had changed. The general editor said, our main demographic today is English teachers who have either never read the novel they're assigned to teach, or worse, they don't understand it. So they need to read the Cliff Notes. And the reason for that is they're taking all these education courses, many hours of education courses in college, and they're taking fewer content courses. So even if the education courses weren't any good regarding method, which they generally are not, the teachers don't know enough content. So it's not hard. I'm considered a good teacher. I have several Teacher of the Year awards. If I had to train teachers, I could do in one course. If they know their content, if they know math teachers know math, and the English teachers know English, the science teachers know science, I could teach them how to teach in one course. It doesn't take 4 years of college. And that's what we were talking about. I would tell them, give examples, pull the explanatory principles out of the examples, tell stories, tie apply the ideas to observational reality, move around the classroom, generate excitement, yell if you have to, not in anger, but in, in enthusiasm. Write stuff on the board, make sure the kids write it down so their motor skills are engaged, as well as their eyes and ears, and so on and so forth. You do it in one semester, in one course. Doesn't take 4 years, but the teachers need to know the content, and they don't. They're not experts anymore in most cases. Some are, most aren't. They don't know enough to teach high school English classes or math classes in many cases.
And I do want to talk about some of the solutions that you talk about, including that. I mean, one thing you talk about privatizing schools, and you even answer some common objections about it, which I think a lot of us agree with, but we're just unsure of the kind of mechanics as to how we get from here to there.
Yeah. Well, I think, ultimately the goal, my good friend, my good buddy, Brad Thompson, down at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, calls himself an abolitionist, that the goal here is to abolish the government school system. And he's right. That's the ultimate goal. And here's a little bit of progress. 20 years ago, going further back, if you talk about abolishing the government school system, in most cases, you wouldn't get a hearing, and people thought you were a freaking lunatic. But today, so many people realize, you see the parents rising up against the school boards, for example. So many people realize that the government school system is just a wreck. It's an absolute wreck. And when you talk about privatizing the school system now, people still don't want to go along with that yet, but you could get a hearing today. I think we made a little progress with that. But the first step, I think, because this is a long process, the first, but worth fighting for. The first step, I think, is these parents who are so disgruntled with the school system to realize the school system cannot be redeemed. It's an impregnable fortress, as E.D. Hirsch called it. It won't be changed. They don't want. Look, we're yelling at them. You're not training the kids to learn, and and their attitude is, we don't want the kids to learn. They're not going to change. They don't want the kids to read well. They don't want the kids to know academic subjects. They want the kids today to be indoctrinated with leftist propaganda and obey the socialist and ultimately communist state. That's the goal. It's irredeemable. The parents need to pull the kids out of the schools, and there's a lot of options, and more are. Homeschooling has grown substantially over the last few years. And my buddy Brad Thompson pointed out to me, here's a really good piece of information. The leading demographic who are moving towards homeschooling are Black Americans. They realize the schools are just terrible. They're not teaching our kids, and then more and more Black Americans are pulling their kids out of the school and homeschooling. But for any racial group, there's a lot of options today. Homeschooling is one. It's legal in every state in the country. Homeschool co-ops, where parents pool their resources, and like
that's great.
Yeah, and I mean, it's in the blue states. I think it's harder than in the red states. They put the leftist places put more obstacles in the path of homeschool co-ops, but in some states it's completely legal. Scott, I know you're in Florida. I'll bet it's with DeSantis as governor. I'll bet it's legal in Florida.
It is.
For example, that parents can pool their resources. So one kid's dad, is an engineer. He teaches the kids math, and another kid's mom, is an avid reader, and she really has an English degree, and she teaches the kids literature, so on and so forth. And they pool their resources in that way, and it's enormously helpful. Then we discussed micro schools. There's more and more disgruntled teachers, and I think parents can find them. Contract with them to start a little school in one of the parents' living room or rec room or basement. That's happening all across the country. Like I said, it's so widespread a phenomenon. Even Forbes, which is a business magazine, had an article on a year or so ago.
Now, I remember there was a German family on trial for homeschooling a couple of years ago. And so as we kind of are building these globalist ties to EU countries, I mean, can we expect, more restrictions on homeschooling?
Yeah. Here's where we give the religious conservatives credit. They were a big part of the demographic that fought for the legal right to homeschool in this country, in state after state after state. So I disagree with the conservatives on any number of issues, but that was a big step forward. And yeah, the leftists hate it. They hate it. Yeah, German family. You're right. In Germany, not a German American family, a German family in
Right.
Germany. Yeah, that was famous case. Yeah, I think we're going to see, as more and more parents pull their kids out of the government schools, you're going to see the left react to that. They don't want parents educating the children. They want the kids in the government schools where they can be indoctrinated. So I think we're going to see a lot of pushback against that from the left, and we need to keep fighting for the parents' right to homeschool.
So in the short term, I like the idea of privatized schools and homeschooling, these micro schools. I think that's all great, especially if they're using the principles of like phonics and teaching academics and this sort of. But ideally, like in the long term, I think you say in the book that it's like a big dream to abolish the public schools or the government schools. And I think that's what needs to happen in the long term. And one way you suggest of, starting this process, I guess, is by like outflanking the Borg chip and trying to like, I guess, lay siege to it. So I'm curious, like, what is that process like? Like, are we going to be outflanking them and surrounding them and then crushing them, like trying to starve them out? Or like, how do you actually break down and get the public school system abolished?
Well, I think we've been discussing what it means to outflank. We could circumvent or outflank the government school system. They won't be changed, but by pulling the kids out, and you starve the monster of victims, and actually educate the children. And what you said just now, William, is right. Most of the parents who are homeschooling do so because they recognize the kids need phonics, to learn how to read, because they want to teach the kids academic subjects, and so on and so forth. And they realize there's a lot of resources available for homeschoolers now, a lot of online resources, a lot of books on homeschooling. The Well-Trained Mind by Susan Weisbau and Jessica Wise is a great book for homeschoolers. A lot of resources, and this is how I think we get a society of much more educated people by this process. But I think this is the method to outflank the government school system, and I think it's a long-term dream to actually abolish the schools. But if we starve the monster of victims, it's very possible that more and more people will realize, hey, the homeschoolers are doing better than the government school kids. Maybe we should at least think about abolishing the government school system and encouraging parents to homeschool. Because there's another thing that parents could do, to really educate the kids. And you want to show honest people, and the homeschoolers tend to do much better on tests, or any metric you want to mention, any measurement you want to mention. The homeschoolers tend to do as well as private school kids, and much better than the government school kids by any measurement available. We want to show honest people this works. Most Americans want the kids to be well educated. This works. The government school system does not. And over a period of years, it's possible we convince more and more people that this is the way to go. The government school system is an irredeemable disaster, and homeschooling works. And one other option I just want to mention that we haven't discussed, that I talk about in the book, is tutors. Right. Parents can hire tutors. Whether it's in person, or one good thing that came out of the pandemic was the widespread use of Zoom. And so, for example, I mean, I'm a tutor, but for families, one family in Minnesota, one, and for a few other people. But so let's say you're, a homeschooler in Michigan, let's say, and you want, you're not expert in chemistry or history or whatever. You can, there are sites, varsitytutors.com, for example, There are kids, young kids in their 20s or late 20s, getting PhD, let's say. You're looking for somebody to tutor the kids in chemistry, let's say. There's somebody, here's a 28-year-old getting a PhD in chemistry at the University of Oregon, halfway across the country from you in Michigan. But he knows the subject matter because he majored in chemistry in college, not in education. And now he's in grad school getting a master's degree or a PhD in chemistry, not in education. Coming out of college, he already knows more chemistry than the high school chemistry teachers do. Now, getting a graduate degree in that content course, he knows vastly more. And he's a graduate student, which means he's not working full time. He's probably starving. You can get him cheap. So it's got to be done by Zoom. But sometimes you find somebody in your area, you could do it in person, which is always best. But much better to have an expert teaching your kids, chemistry than having the high school teachers who had a major in education and don't know that much of the sciences. Tutoring is effective, and it's not as expensive as we would think, because graduate students need money, and you could get them, relatively inexpensively. And it's in their self-interest because they're building a teaching resume. If they get a strong reference from the parents, it helps them get future teaching jobs, and they're getting paid, to make money in their field of expertise. It's a very good form of education, certainly relative to what the kids get in the government school system.
I'd like to get your idea on the importance of speaking up and talking to the school boards and things like that. Because what I see now, on some YouTube channels that I watch, is the parents will get up at school board meetings or city council meetings, and they'll speak up against CRT and the woke culture and all this nonsense going on in schools. But should this be should speaking and communication skills be taught as a fundamental program in elementary school? You mentioned the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but maybe I think speaking should be up there as one of the top 4 things to teach.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think with with the well-trained mind, I like that title of that book, but I call them the wise girls. The well-trained mind, I don't think it's that difficult to teach communication skills. So by the time you get to high school, let's say, and the kid's been, has been taught phonics and is a strong reader and has been writing paragraphs on the books that they read for several years, and then short essays. And by the time you get to high school, they're writing full essays, and they've been taught the basics of science, and they've been taught they have strong skills in arithmetic and basic mathematical calculation. The kids have thinking skills. They know history. A good deal of content in history and literature and science. Yeah, I think speaking skills is good. Of course, like Leonard Peikoff had a course in objective communication. 1 semester course on that. I think for kids who have a lot of knowledge, they have something to say. They know something. If you don't know anything, you can't communicate.
And it occurs to me that in a culture that has trouble reading, being able to communicate verbally would be a benefit, to someone who's trying to change the educational system, because these people aren't going to read your essay. I have trouble getting people to read what I write, on Facebook or some discussion forum. But if I were just to go off in the street and start speaking, I'd probably gather a crowd around me, and people would be like, "What's this guy what's this crazy dude talking about?"
Yeah, Speaker's Corner.
Yeah, you could just go in the corner and talk about flat Earth and get 10 people around you.
You can. No, you're right. Verbal communication is an important skill, and I think the good news, of course, the fundamentals here, of course, like we've been saying, to teach the kids knowledge, because if you don't know anything, then you have nothing of any importance to say. But once the kids have a good deal of knowledge in these important subjects, then verbal communication skills, I think that can be taught effectively in the high schools in 1 course. But here's an example. Today, the kids are taught very little science, very, very, very little science. And so it's easy to hoodwink them with claims of, pernicious human-caused warming is destroying the planet, because they don't know they know basically nothing. about real science. But if they get science training, and they know something about geology, and they know something about the Earth's history, and they know prior to the modern warm period was the little ice age, before that was the medieval warm period, before that was the dark age cold period, before that was the Roman warm period. The Earth cycles endlessly in terms of climate change, and they know basics. They know basics like that. Now, if you in high school you teach them basic communication skills, they have that's a good combination. They know something and they know how to communicate verbally. I mean, and they've been writing essays all along, so they know how to communicate it literarily. But like you said, unfortunately, a lot of people won't read the essay. But now they know how to communicate their knowledge verbally. So it's definitely a positive. I agree.
I do want to get a chance for us to talk about elections, but I am just curious because you do talk about some, smaller ideas to make practical changes like goodwill in classrooms and later start times. You also talk about an order of teaching subjects, and I was just curious if that's at all at odds with the Montessori method that I hear described as letting the students have a say in like how long they spend on a subject.
Yeah, I like Maria Montessori's methods. I think the ideal is, like in the school day, you divide the school day morning and afternoon, and with lunch in the middle. And in the morning, look, I teach college, and I know a lot of college professors. They're arrogant. We teach higher education. We're such big shots, But the truth is, the most important level of education is elementary school, and maybe even preschool. The earlier you start teaching the children to read and basic thinking skills, the better. And that's the most important levels. And I think if I was to run an elementary school, and I don't know enough about elementary yet, so I went to elementary school. That's all I know. I never taught at the elementary level, and that's the most important and the most difficult. Because if you're in a classroom with 25 6-year-olds, can you imagine? I think that's the real courageous job, even more than a Navy SEAL. Being in a room, trapped in a room with 25 6-year-olds. Oh man, that's scary. But I mean, elementary school teachers need to learn, classroom management as well as teaching. Nevertheless, so I think morning I would focus on the cognitive skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, all the academic subjects in the basics. And in the afternoon, I think I love Maria Montessori's program. She has materials, her own materials in all these fields, in science and history and literature and math. And in the afternoon, the child, I think, should be encouraged, pursue your love, little Johnny, pursue your love, little Mary. And, I love Maria Montessori's. If a kid's reading a book, Mary's reading a book on history, and Johnny's read it already, comes over and he offers to talk to her about it, it's her choice. If she wants to talk to him about it, that's her choice. If she wants to continue reading, that's her choice. It respects the individual. Montessori's method respects the individual, unlike and against the progressives method, where you're not allowed to go off on your own and read a book if you want to. You have to work with the group. You have to learn how to conform and cooperate with the group. I love Maria Montessori's method there for two reasons. You encourage, it's really loving the child. You tell them that you're really recognizing the child. Like for me, I was never a good math student, for example. It would have been great. This would have been great for me, because in the afternoon, they would tell little Andy, you're a future writer. Go ahead. We have all this literature here. You love history. You're a humanities guy, little Andy. You're a humanities guy. You're going to end up getting a PhD in philosophy. We have all these history books. We have these literature books. Go ahead. Follow your love. I mean, how loving is that? It really respects the child's values and recognizes who he or she is. I think that's a very good method. I asked my buddy Mike Gustafson, who runs a Montessori school up in Massachusetts, about that. So I said to him, in your school, if little Andy was going to your school, you'd hold my hand through the math program, and then you'd encourage me to read literature. He said, yes, absolutely. And and I love that. I think it's a very good approach to education. Give the kid the basics, and then let them focus on what they love and what their future life is going to be filled with.
Well, my cousin is a Montessori school teacher. And so I've seen firsthand, and I visited her in class because of my nephews, or my, you know, my adopted nephews, not my real nephews, but I've seen in person like how the Montessori classroom works, and it's amazing, how well behaved and how smart these kids are. And so I've seen firsthand the benefit of the Montessori method. Um, but I think that there is just a general benefit to like one-on-one interaction. So I like the smaller classrooms. So even if you have a not ideal method of teaching, it's critical to have, treat the kids individually and spend enough time with them to make them feel observed and paid attention to. I think that's what develops their sense of individuality, is that they get a sense that the teacher's recognizing them and paying attention to them and letting them do what they are best at or want to do.
Right. And that's one other great benefit of the micro schools. They're generally small. You have one teacher, the classic school marm, with 3 or 4 families, 6, 8, or 10 kids, and she could focus on these kids individually. Through the day, the kids get a lot of individual attention, and that's how. To take somebody who's the ne plus ultra of this was the great Margaret Collins. She opted out of the Chicago government school system circa, I don't know, when was that, 1970s, and started a little school in her home, and eventually, with a few kids, and eventually she's such a great teacher, expanded into, a full scale private school, West Side Prep. And by the way, she did great. She took these kids who the government school system deemed ineducable, a lot of the minority kids that the government schools thought this just couldn't learn serious material, and she helped them become just superb students. You did really, really, really well, and she had young kids reading the Fountainhead and understanding it. So this can certainly be done. As you start off with a lot of individualized attention for the kids. I agree with you, and I think small classes help. But by the way, I recommended in the book, and I would recommend now for people who think, Bernstein, Dr. Bernstein, some of these kids can't learn the demanding academic program that you want. I recommend the movie about Margaret Collins, the Margaret Collins story, with was it Cicely Tyson and a very young Morgan Freeman, who I didn't even recognize at first when I was watching the movie. The Margaret Collins story. Some of these Teacher in the Hood movies are true stories, and they're really good. My favorite is Stand and Deliver, about Jaime Escalante, in El Barrio in LA, teaching these Chicano kids calculus.
Yeah, that was a good movie. I like that.
Yeah, it shows how with good teaching, and Margaret Collins is like the ne plus ultra. She's like the goddess of the best of it. A combination of tough love, tender love, and unyielding, high, uncompromisingly high academic standards. She brought these kids up to very high cognitive levels. So my conclusion here is any human being with a healthy brain, is not retarded or brain damaged or cerebrally challenged, whatever the politically correct terminology is. Any human being, either gender, any race, any nationality or tribe, anyone with a healthy brain, this is the overwhelming preponderance of the human population, can learn a great deal of academic subjects, certainly learn how to read and write effectively, can learn basic mathematical calculations. Not that hard for any human being who has a healthy brain, if they have motivated, and if they have a good teacher like Margaret Collins or Jaime Escalante or somebody like that, or Helen Keller had Annie Sullivan. A good teacher is very valuable. And I'll stand by this till the day I die. Any human being with a healthy brain can rise to a substantially high level of knowledge. And again, the key is to learn how to read well at a very early age. And it's the 2 steps I was talking about before: motivate the child and then use systematic phonics. If those 2 things are done, it's no more difficult for a child to learn how to read than it is for him to learn how to ride a bike. and once he or she's a strong reader, the whole world of knowledge is open to that person.
That's a great transition. Again, the book is Why Johnny Still Can't Read or Write or Understand Math and What We Can Do About It. And we'll put a link up in the show notes as well. In our last minutes, I do, obviously we're probably not going to have too much privatization of education if we can't even get 50 votes in the Senate. So, we had these Tuesday results, and it turned out there wasn't even that much of a red wave, or there's still results coming in at this point. So we'll see.
Very disappointing to me, because to me it's very clear. Let's put it simply: the religious conservatives are a mixed case. The left is evil. And to me, that's very clear. And consequently, I was hoping for a red wave, and I don't know if we even got a red trickle. Looks like the Republicans will win the House, maybe, but the Senate, I don't know.
No, it's not going to be. The House is probably going to go Republican by a couple of seats, and then the Senate, it's whether it's going to be 49 or 50. I think just the way it looks today.
Well, Laxalt was slightly ahead in Nevada the last I saw. I don't know if that's changed, although the incumbent, I forget her name, was slowly catching up to him. If he wins in Nevada, that's 50 seats for the Republicans.
Right.
And then if Walker wins the runoff in Georgia, then they have the Senate. But
that would be. I'm going to predictit.com or predictit.org for the most updated stats, and Laxalt was something like 13%. So I just
13% chance to win that vote.
Right.
But they had, like, last I saw, there was like 90% of the vote counted.
You're right. These are
slightly ahead.
These are what the betting markets are giving us instantly as where things are right now.
Okay. Well, maybe he won't win, in which case, even if Walker wins the runoff in Georgia, then the Democrats will still, with a 50-50 split, they'll still control the Senate with our lovely vice president's vote.
Yeah. I have made this prediction. I think Biden will resign next year and Kamala Harris will become president. They'll give her a year to kind of turn things around. They'll call anyone a bigot who questions her competence. And if she can't pull it off, they'll run Newsom against her.
You could be right. I mean, I have no way of knowing. Harris checks off a number of boxes for the woke bigots of the left. So,
it's been Biden's dream to be president for a long time. Why would he resign?
Well, if he's not planning to run again, and also this stuff with Hunter Biden is coming out, even if the Republicans have a slight majority in Congress. Grassley has indicated, that he'll try to pursue things, and I see it as a way of making it so they don't have to make a decision about him running the next year. They get a woman president in there, and
a black woman.
Right.
Yeah, but they would have to have some serious blackmail material against Biden to force him to resign. I think that he's too committed to being president. I think he picked Kamala as insurance against them trying to knock him out of the presidency because Kamala is so bad.
I went out on a limb. You'll say it's a good pick if it happens.
Yeah, no. They could blackmail him, William. I mean, all they got to do is say, you're close to Bill and Hill, aren't you? You know how many people died under mysterious circumstances? You want that to happen to Dr. Jill? You want that to happen to Hunter?
I'm convinced Hillary is why he didn't run in 2016.
I'm sorry. What was that? What was that about Hillary?
Hillary is why Biden didn't run in 2016 as the sitting vice president.
Right. That's right.
So the Clintons have something on him.
Well, people die who are close to the Clintons. Many of them under mysterious circumstances. They can certainly, they can always threaten, subtly threaten. You want Dr. Jill to die in a car accident, big boy. No, no, I mean,
I don't know if that would persuade him. It would have to be something related to like his corruption or something like that, something that would
well,
destroy his legacy.
well, there's plenty of that. But I don't know
Yeah.
how much time we have left because I don't know what's going to happen. You may be right, Scott. I have no idea. But I do know this. This election, the 2020 presidential, I think there's evidence, good deal of evidence that there was, chicanery and fraud in various parts of the country. I thought Dinesh D'Souza did a nice job with his movie 2000 Mules, pointing out part of that. And I think a full-scale investigation of that election should be done. But the 2022 midterms, I don't see any evidence for wide-scale voter fraud. I think what this showed me, sadly and terrifyingly, is that the left has the votes. They simply have the votes all across the country. There's gazillions of people who are little mini leftists or fellow travelers who go along with it for whatever reason. I know the reason, and it relates to the main topic that we've discussed. And that is because year after year after year after year, the high schools churn out hundreds of thousands, at least, of semi-illiterate, poorly educated graduates who are thoroughly indoctrinated with leftist propaganda. And so they have the votes, and it's only going to get worse because the leftists control the school system utterly. And they're just going to churn out more and more little leftists who will vote Democrat, no matter how much of a disaster Biden is. They understandably complain about inflation and a down economy, and the price of fuel oil in the winter and gasoline prices. They understandably complain about that and then vote Democrat because they're indoctrinated little leftists or middle-aged leftists or whatever. It's going to get worse. So I think the political point here is tied directly to the educational point that was our focus today. Parents need to pull their kids out of the government schools and homeschool co-ops, micro schools, tutors, whatever it is, for two reasons. The fundamental one, of course, is they want their kids to actually get an education, but it has benign political consequences because that way the kids will escape a great deal of the leftist indoctrination and they learn to read well and to write well. Right now, the kids can't read. A lot of the kids come out of high school, most of them can't read Ayn Rand's novels. They can't read the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They can't read the Federalist Papers. They can't read the economic writings of, Hayek or Milton Friedman or Ludwig von Mises. They can't handle that. But if they're homeschooled and they're strong readers, they could read this whole literature of liberty. So the whole world of knowledge is open to them. And then there's a chance to have a positive political impact with a society of educated people. And like I said, if they know science, anybody who knows even a modicum of science will look at the global warming theory and go, what are you talking about? The Earth cycles constantly, and the modern warm period is no warmer, in fact, less warm than many of the warm periods in the relatively recent past, like the last few thousand years, never mind.
But they're being taught by these teachers that don't see it from that perspective.
Yeah. They're being taught more and more by leftist propaganda, teachers who are leftist propagandists more than they are masters of their content and masters of their subject matter. But if they're pulled out of the government schools, they're not indoctrinated with the leftist propaganda. They have a chance at least, to if they're strong readers and they have basic thinking skills, they have a chance at least to read the essays in the books that we were talking about before. Well, you said they can't read that, they won't read or can't read essays now, but then they'll be able to. They can even go. I mean, I published 2 essays on climate change. They're on my website. Anybody who can read could read them. Look at all the data. Look at all the data. But the kids are propagandized, and they're certainly not taught any kind of objective method. They simply get in most cases leftist propaganda, and they're brainwashed.
There's kind of a vicious cycle, I think, that is the real problem underlying all of this. It's like, smart, intelligent parents go to college, get an education, and they can afford the kids because they have good jobs. And then what happens is they support the government schools that will indoctrinate their kids to be little Marxists.
Right.
And so it's
That's it.
like, at some point, don't we have to blame half of the population of parents? Like it's the parents that need to get their act together. They're supporting the government schools.
Absolutely. That's why it's very encouraging to see the parents rallying against the school boards, around the country, because it shows us they recognize something's horribly wrong with the schools. And by the way, there was a poll taken for the American Federation of Teachers over the summer. What did the parents want? And the parents were very clear. They said less propaganda and more academic subjects. That's what they want. And so the parents are recognizing the government schools are broken. But if by rallying against the school boards, if they think they're going to improve the government schools, that's a mistake. That's an error. They need to use their recognition of the failure of the government school to realize they're irremediably broken. It can't be remediated. They need to pull the kids out of the school and educate them at home in one form or another. They have a lot of options today. We've been discussing the options. Yes, the parents need to step up, on behalf of the children that they love. And if they do that, like I said, there's at least a possibility that it will have benign political consequences, because the kids will know how to read, and they can read Ayn Rand, and then they can read, von Mises and the free market economists, and they can read. Scientists write books for the intelligent layman. For us, I can't read the journal articles they write for each other; it goes over my head. But the popular books, which I have read, and I base my essays, on climate change on that. They could read, strong readers, and could read the popular books by, climate scientists, like, people like Fred Singer or Richard Lindzen, or people, what's his name, Patrick Michaels, have written books for the intelligent layman on Tim Ball, who passed away recently, written several books, for the intelligent layman on climate change. If they're strong readers, they can read that. But if they're weak readers, they can't read it, and that's why the leftists, so-called progressives, don't want the kids reading. Well, they don't want the kids. Let's put it this way, guys. In 1918, 1920, Dewey and William Harold Kilpatrick at Columbia, they couldn't have foreseen Ayn Rand's books. She was 13 or 14 or 15 years old at the time. But they foresaw the possibility that somebody like Ayn Rand might come along and write, the kind of books that she did. And they've made sure 100 years later that the overwhelming bulk of American high school graduates can't read Ayn Rand's books.
Well, that's not the best note to end things on, but
well, let's end on a good note. If the parents pull the kids out of the
right.
schools and teach them phonics from a very early age, the kids can read Ayn Rand's books. And a lot of these homeschoolers do read Ayn Rand's books.
You're right. That is a good point, and that is a place for hope. William, do you have any final thoughts?
I just want to thank you, Andy, for coming back on the show. It was a true pleasure talking to you. And I look forward to future conversations. I know I bought your fictional stories, the Brooklyn stories. So I look forward to reading those, and I hope to discuss them with you in a future podcast.
Thanks, William, and thanks, Scott. It's always a pleasure talking to you guys, especially on such a fundamental topic like education, and on the possibly benign political consequences of parents stepping up and for their kids. And yeah, if you guys want to discuss the Brooklyn stories in a future podcast, that'll be even more fun. So thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for being here. Again, it's why Johnny still can't read or write or understand math and what we can do about it. It's a great read, and it's an important read. So we appreciate it. We'll look forward to having you back for Brooklyn Stories. And I'm Scott Schiff, along with William Swig for the Ayn Rand Fan Club, and we will see you next time.